This is Transqat, a safe space to stand. Transgender issues, queer people, respectful conversations. I'm host Claire McCarthy. Welcome to Transqat. Welcome to the final episode in a series of 5 shows celebrating Middletown Pride. My name is Claire McCarthy. I'm the producer and the host of Transqat, the podcast. You can learn more about me and the show at transqat.com. That's TRANSQAT.com. These 5 programs are a collaborative effort among Transqat, WESU, and Middletown Pride. In addition to this on-air broadcast, you can find them at the Middletown Pride website, middletownpride.org. And finally, you can access a fuller version of the conversation at the Transqat website, our YouTube channel, and everywhere podcasts are available. Today's show focuses on the evolving language of SOGIE, that is to say, sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. This episode, like Caesar's Gaul, is divided into 3 parts. In the first, we're talking about the terms cis and trans. We'll look at the linguistic origins, their use in conversations about SOGIE, and the challenges of framing a conversation about these concepts. The second segment is a chat with Bill Ollayos and Robin McHaelen from the LGBTQ Justice and Opportunity Network about the social and legal ramifications of this new-to-some vocabulary. Last is an explanation from this former Latin teacher on how pronouns work in English and why there is indeed a problem with them. It's just not the one they're telling you about. You are listening to WESU Middletown 88.1 FM.
Let's face it, life is scary. We face so many problems: war, terror, violence, disease, and commercial radio stations.
The constant playing of the same songs over and over again destroyed my ears and my sanity.
Having my favorite songs interrupted by commercials made me a compulsive shopper. The viewpoints, they're so homogenous.
Commercial radio killed my dog.
You can help these poor people by donating to WESU, commercial-free community radio, combating the terror of commercial radio since 1939. Donate now online at www.wesufm.org.
Using a chainsaw, do not attempt to stop the chain with your hands.
Using the chainsaw, do not attempt to stop the chain with your hands. When using the chainsaw, do not attempt to stop the chain with your hands. When using the chainsaw, do not attempt to stop the chain with your hands.
This message brought to you by WESU Middletown.
If we're going to have a conversation about gender, we need to agree on a common vocabulary. To that end, here are some thoughts. Trans and cis were Latin prepositions.
It's not enough they ruin the pronouns. They have to trash the prepositions too.
Cis meant on this side of, and trans meant across or on that side of. Of course, in Latin, it would be pronounced trans and kiss, but let's not make things more complicated. When the Roman army started moving out of Italy and beginning its empire, they ran into a pretty serious geographic obstacle, the Alps. They named the province south of the Alps Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul on this side of the Alps, and the province north of the mountain range Transalpine Gaul, Gaul on the far side of the Alps. Perfectly logical. But on this side and on that side are relative descriptions. They rely on you accepting the idea that the city of Rome is the center of the world. If you were describing Gaul from, say, Ireland's point of view, Transalpine and Cisalpine would be reversed. Keep this in mind as we apply trans and cis to gender. When we're born, a doctor takes a peek between our legs and makes an assignment. And that assignment is either male or female. You might hear people use the acronyms AMAB and AFAB for assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth. Now, maybe in your life so far, you've never questioned this setup. You've never asked, is this the only way? Or is this just? Is this ethical? I've spent my life wrestling with questions like this. Specifically, why are there only two choices? Why does this decision, which is going to affect nearly every aspect of my socialization for the rest of my life, need to be made immediately when I draw my first breath? And when, if ever, do I get to have any input in this life-defining choice? There's a line in the Leonard Cohen song, My Secret Life. It goes, "The dealer wants you thinking that it's either black or white. Thank God it's not that simple." Is it possible that there isn't a hard and fast border between male and female? Can we conjure an image of gender as a circle, or better yet, a sphere with room for all of us? No one left out. At the very least, can we consider that any possible dividing line is much less of a brick wall and more of a permeable membrane? If questioning the status quo like this makes you uncomfortable, I get it. Really, I do. I was taught that bodies carry either XX or XY chromosomes. They produce either testosterone or estrogen. They grow boobs or they grow beards. And they have a penis or they have a vagina. Now brace yourselves before I say this next part. These statements are not false. But they're not absolutes. There are variations in chromosomes, hormones, external genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics. Estimates are that there are 3 to 5 million people with intersex conditions just in the U.S. alone. All right, rewind a bit. The doctor assigns you male or female based on what that doctor sees between your legs. Now, if you spend your childhood and your adolescence, and your adulthood feeling perfectly fine about that, A, you're lucky, and B, you're probably cisgender. If the doctor's somewhat arbitrary, rushed, and unilateral fiat causes you considerable distress the way it did me, well, you might be transgender. To return to the metaphor, the doctor's assignment, that moment of decision, in which I have no autonomy, is Rome on the map. It's arbitrary, and the words cisgender and transgender are inherently biased. This side implies where the majority is. That side implies otherness. Let me give you a different metaphor. For the longest time, this is how electricity worked in your house. Lights are on, lights are off. And that was fine as far as it went, but then we realized that there are more than two options. If you have a date coming over and you want romantic lighting, you can dim the switch. And if you're my age and you're reading at night, you're going to want to push the knob all the way up. And once we realized that there were, in fact, a lot more than two options, nobody panicked. Nobody screamed, "Abomination! You're desecrating the memory of Tesla and Edison." There was more diversity than we had originally thought, and that improved our lives. So when somebody says to you, "I'm non-binary," they're saying that there's no room for them in a system that demands you pick a label and keep it stuck to your forehead for the duration of your life. Maybe they're both male and female. Maybe they're neither. Maybe it depends on when and where they are. And there's the challenge. If we're going to have a rational conversation about gender and sex, folks might have to give up on ideas that were taught to us as we were children and that were reinforced on the playground, in high school, in the dating arena, and in the workplace. And that's not easy. But we need a shared vocabulary. So what are the options? We can say trans folks and non-trans folks, but to me that seems inappropriate. Non-trans people are the majority, so why would we define them by what they're not? We could say transgender and cisgender folks, but let me just say out loud what some of you are thinking. I'm not a cisgender man. I'm just a man. I get it. Why would you adopt a label that somebody else invented for you? Another option, we can refer to cisgender and non-cisgender folks, which keeps the cis folks as the base unit of measure. But if you don't want to call yourself cis, that falls apart pretty quickly, even though you get to remain the center of the universe. And the rhetoric has taken this idea and run wild with it. Cisgender has been weaponized to the point where now it's problematic. If you use it, then you're woke and you're part of the problem, which leaves the option that many people probably want to say just reflexively, which is to say, I am not a cisgender woman, I'm a normal woman, which I guess makes me an abnormal woman. And I reject that proposition outright. When an ally chooses to use the phrase cisgender to describe themselves, they are doing nothing more than opening the possibility of having a respectful dialogue. They are admitting, first of all, that we gender-expansive people exist. They are admitting that cisgender, or whatever better term we might come up with in the future, is neither the only nor the most important type of person. And they admit that because this cultural conversation is relatively new, they've had a long and powerful run of assuming that they were the default setting. And that comes with privilege some of us just don't have. One last try at a metaphor. Pie plates are perfectly round. The dough for the crust, once you roll it out, is not. So what do? Some people take scissors and pare away the bits that don't fit the prescribed shape. Others tuck it underneath so everything looks neat and tidy. No one will know if they don't see it. I apologize if this metaphor is too obvious. There have always been trans and non-binary and intersex folks, but religion, science, and patriarchal Western societies have, at best, relegated us to a footnote, a curiosity. They decided that we were anomalies. We were extraneous, we were not needed, and we would not be missed. This conversation about gender that I keep talking about, these are the stakes. We are here. We have always been here. We will always be here. And now, for some reason, I'm hungry for pie.
Would you like some pie?
Massive quantities and a glass of water, sweetheart. My socks are on fire.
Son, the chief financial officer of Transqat Enterprises, will be joining us at least for a while. A friend recently texted me after watching one of my episodes and said, there was considerably more cat butt than I anticipated. So
always a good surprise.
Okay, so I'm Robin McHaelen. I was the founder and executive director of True Colors for about 29 years. Retired in 2020 and have continued teaching. And, I'm the secretary for the LGBT Justice and Opportunity Network, and I'm on the Hate Crimes Commission. Was appointed by Lamont to the Hate Crimes Commission.
And most recently on the show this year, talking about the glorious return of SOGIE Con.
The conference, yeah. It really went great, especially the first year back. And yeah, it was very exciting, and I think next year is going to be even better.
Well, and so I'm Bill, he, him pronouns, William Ollayos. I am a JD candidate at the Quinnipiac University School of Law, and I'm also the administrator for Connecticut's LGBTQ Justice and Opportunity Network. And that's how I get the honor of working with Robin.
Fantastic. Robin, I wanted to start with you. When you were on the show earlier this season, you launched into this wonderful introduction that was both an introduction to the language, but also an exercise in breathing control. And I thought that might be a really great place to start if you wouldn't mind running through that.
Not at all. When I do a lot of training. And so I always start with the litany of the language, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, questioning, two-spirit, same gender loving, pansexual, fluxual, not straight, not labeling, straightish, straight so far, straight with options, straight but stuff happens, gender bending, bigender, pangender, agender, asexual, and non-binary, and other. And the thing is that the language just continues to change and evolve. And really what it does, I think, is nuance, that people are able to sort of think more deeply about sexuality and gender and find more sort of places where it's the right fit, rather than having one box that everybody's supposed to somehow fit into. People are, thinking of sexuality and gender. And I don't remember where I got this image from some young person, that image of sexuality and gender as a universe, and that all these little stars are all the different options. And I think it's interesting. There just was a very big debate on Facebook around the use of the term SOGIE.
And for those who are not familiar, Robin, sorry.
SOGIE stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And SOGIE is sort of a container for all humans, right? Because all humans have a sexual orientation, whether it's asexual, or multisexual, or any place in between. All humans have a sexual orientation. All humans have a gender identity, from agender to multigender to whatever, all the different stars in the universe. And everybody has gender expression, that they choose to express themselves in a variety of ways through how they dress and express, externally. The hard thing with gender expression is that people make assumptions about gender identity based on gender expression. And gender expression and gender identity don't have to have anything to do with each other.
You are listening to WESU Middletown, 88.1 FM. Right. And most certainly not connected to your sexuality.
Exactly. And not connected to your, each of those are separate but related, sort of areas or identities. LGBTQ plus, or people with minoritized sexual and gender identities, are a sort of a subunit within SOGIE. And that's where I focus most of my life and my work, in that subunit of SOGIE. And just as a shorthand, our experiences as queer folk, is very different than the experiences of straight and cisgender folk. That the world looks different through our lenses and through our experiences. And so I try to use SOGIE when I'm doing trainings to explain, to sort of engage the people in the room who are straight and cisgender, to recognize that they are part of the whole community, that we all have this in common, and that certain identities have different experiences in the world. And I don't ever equate racism or race or ethnicity with orientation. I think that, and gender, I think that they're different instruments of oppression. But but there's also, it's true that if you've got dark skin, you're going to have a very different experience in the US than if you have light skin. And so, every human has skin, but what kinds of skin you have, helps impact your experiences in the world. And I think the last thing I would say about that is that one of the things that came up when I talked about using SOGIE is that people were very worried that using SOGIE would eliminate the conversation about LGBTQ plus. It would invisibilize an important element of our identities, and that considering the current national environment, that would be doing a disservice. And I agree with that, but I have to think of a both and kind of perspective, both bringing straight and cisgender people into the conversation as allies and accomplices, and recognizing the, sort of unique challenges and strengths of the queer community as a whole.
So you use SOGIE in the place of that LGBTQ initialism?
I use it when I'm talking about all humans, right? When I'm talking about LGBTQ plus people, I use LGBTQ plus or sexual and gender minority folks. I still struggle a little bit with the plus in that, because, and I understand the reason for the plus, because LGBTQ, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But, it leaves out asexual people and two-spirit people and people who identify as same gender loving. And so...
Straight up stuff happens.
straight, but stuff happens. And so, it leaves out a substantial portion of the community who get otherized. So and we haven't really figured out what's another way to do that. So I don't use SOGIE exclusively. When I did the thing, I was out on my walk and I started thinking about SOGIE, and I wanted people to start thinking in terms of SOGIE, because like all the research that's happening now is research on SOGIE, and that the reason it's research on SOGIE is that in the past, when they tried to figure out what caused orientation, they weren't trying to figure out what caused orientation and gender. They were trying to figure out what caused minority orientation and gender. And so everything looked at everybody's past and tried to figure out what went wrong. And so when they begin to research SOGIE, they're trying to understand what unique combination of nature and nurture results in the individual's outcome, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And until they research that as a whole, looking at it as how it develops in humans, regardless of what direction it goes in. And I don't know why we need the cause anyway, but that's one of the things that comes up all the time. And so, getting people more used to the term seems to me like a helpful movement forward. But there were lots of activists and folks on Facebook who are like, nope, not doing it. So.
Phil, let me ask you, you're younger than I am. How do you approach the word queer as an umbrella term?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question. And I do feel like the word queer brings up a lot of issues of intersectionality, where I feel pretty comfortable using the word gay, but I do think that is tied to my whiteness and sort of how gay as the more popular term has been in certain ways lifted up by white supremacy in a lot of capacities. And so some of my friends of color who are a lot more comfortable with the word queer, even if they are also cis men who date cis men like myself, I think that gets into issues of privilege and oppression and how they might feel excluded by the word gay. And so I use the word queer pretty loosely. I mean, I'm 32, so I'm very much a millennial. And that feels the word queer like a happy home for me. I work at the Wesleyan University Office of Residential Life, and I work largely with Gen Z, starting to border on Gen Alpha students. I think they seem very happy with the word queer, mostly because of the broadness and sort of the restriction or the lack of labels that are inherent to that term, because they're just so much more comfortable than previous generations and even my generation with mucking around with language, just like kind of mucking around with any sort of label. No, I don't like this binary. I don't like this restriction. I'm going to try something else. And so I think they are really inclined to enjoying an umbrella term that creates more freedom and sort of diversity of expression in that way.
Well, I see two avenues, and Robin, this comes out in large part of what you were just saying, where this really matters, because I can see somebody who is an ally or a potential ally saying, well, I'm not going to run through that whole list that Robin just did. And one avenue is, how do we have conversations with people who are not in the community where we don't scare them off by using so many words that they can't keep track of it. The other is getting to what your organization deals with, and that is the way you word things in legislation, in policy. Those words matter, and we've seen this in the just slurry of executive orders, right? Every time they refer to a trans feminine athlete, they insist on using the term biological male, and language gets weaponized. Maybe we should take those two things separately. Robin, you started to jump in.
The reason I start with the litany of language is two reasons. One, to let people know that the language is changing and how humans are describing themselves in their experiences may be very different than they grew up with, number one. And number two, you don't have to keep up. You just have to keep open. And that just because I know all those words doesn't mean I know what people's experiences are within those words. And I joke that I always ask young people how they identify. I never ask grown-ups because grown-ups get all cranky. But but I do ask young people, and then no matter what they say, I'm going to say something like, thank you for telling me. So what's it like to be a non-binary pansexual femme? Because just because I know what those words mean to me, I don't know what they mean to them. And so it becomes an opportunity for a conversation. And it also takes a lot of pressure off of people to feel like they have to know everything in order to work with the community. They just have to stay open, and they just have to accept and respect. And that if they do those two things, along with a base of knowledge, that often is enough. Although I will tell you, you were talking about cisgender. In the training that I do in a 5-part training, one of the 5 groups just went off around cisgender, that they were not having that at all. It was an interesting experience around how they couldn't quite get a handle on the ways in which, if you don't use cisgender, you're assuming that, cisgender is the norm and doesn't need a name.
Exactly.
That's so interesting too, thinking about intersectionality again. Like, we work with our students at Wesleyan a lot to acknowledge the fact that white people do have a culture and that white culture is a thing. Because if you don't acknowledge that white people have a culture, then you just assume that white existence is sort of the default and anything else is special or unique. So I love to think about what white culture might be. For me, it's hollandaise sauce.
Last year in my class, my intersectionality, the group was really half kids who were white and half kids who were black or brown. And I broke them up into 2 groups. If you identify as white, go over here. If you identify as a person of color, go over here. I want you to come up with 5 examples of white culture. Go.
What did they get?
The youth of color, their questions were things like, how real can we be? That we want to be kind, but we want to be authentic. And the white kids, were struggling. Of their 5, one was Thanksgiving, right? Which is not a white holiday, right? And one was, and this one really kind of pissed kids off, that this was that they were very polite. It was the best conversation I've ever witnessed. The black and brown kids basically schooled the white kids. Before we started, I said, listen, we're going to do this activity, and some people are going to be really triggered by this, and they're going to get really defensive. And when you feel yourself getting defensive, know that that is information that means that you have something to pay attention to.
I think that's a great assignment, Robin, because anything we can do to make privilege visible, because it's so often this invisible backpack that we're carrying, but that makes people really uncomfortable. So sort of to what you were saying, Claire, about folks really recoiling at the word cis, and we're not going to say that, we're going to say biological male or whatever. Like these arguments over language, anything that you do to sort of highlight a privileged category, I think really freaks people out, because it starts to shake the foundation that they've been reliant on for their whole life. Maybe unintentionally, but they start to feel that threat.
Well, when I was growing up, there was only one word to describe everything that was not heteronormative, and that was gay. If you were a lesbian, you were a gay woman. If you felt like presenting as feminine, even though you were assigned male, is you, well, then you're gay. Everything got conflated into this one word. And for me, that caused a lot of cognitive dissonance. It had to do with my identity, not my sexuality.
Well, Claire, you mentioned that you were a Latin teacher for 30 years, so you must have a lot of thoughts on language and the roots of terms that we're using.
I love the word origin play. I love looking at how grammar is used. Last season, I had a linguist on the show, Dennis Barron, who wrote a book about the history of pronouns. But yeah, those things are really interesting, because there's prescriptive language and then there's descriptive. And what we're in a moment when we're trying to describe something that we all see maybe for the first time, and the prescriptive parts of our language don't have a space for that.
Also thinking about what we do in law school, because so much, and again, I'm still a law student. I have 1 whole year left, so I'm not a practicing attorney yet, but I'm still learning. But so much of the law is entrenched in arguing about language. If you look at the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the Constitution only says what we say that it says. So the 14th Amendment says that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. But the effectiveness of that clause is really dependent on the specific language used in laws and policy. What does equal protection mean? What are the laws? What is any person? And so when we use more inclusive terminology, like precise terms around gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, all of which Robin has explained is encompassed by SOGIE, that really does a better job of ensuring that these protections extend to LGBTQ plus individuals. But otherwise, leaving them invisible and not acknowledging it, that is a lot of what lawyers argue about, in my experience, especially related to constitutional law. What does the Constitution actually mean when it says these sort of amorphous terms. Originalists, which there are still a number on the Supreme Court, versus those folks who take more of a living document approach, which is the idea of like, hey, maybe when this was written centuries ago, they weren't prepared for the impact of expanding notions of gender and sexuality or social media.
But that's why we're seeing these movements to remove protected class from various groups. We saw in 45's administration, he tried to get rid of the ADA, and he's working toward it again here. Trying to remove all LGBTQ folks from protective class means that language can't show up in the laws anymore.
Right. Well, there's that whole scandal where they deleted an individual whose last name was gay. I forget who it was, but like his last name was just gay, and they deleted him from the website because they were trying to remove anything about queer folks. But like, he wasn't queer. His last name just happened to be G-A-Y. Like,
that guy probably didn't have any problems in middle school. He probably just soared right through middle school without a care. You are listening to WESU Middletown 88.1 FM.
Did you know that a tiger can run as fast as 40 miles per hour? That's a fact. Did you know that tigers rock? That's an opinion. WESU has an amazing variety of public affairs shows which are chock full of facts and opinions, but we can only do it with your help. Please go to wesufm.org right now to donate so that these shows can continue to deliver you the truest facts and the freshest opinions. Thank you.
Hey, there's my son.
Hey, Dad.
What's wrong with your voice?
There is nothing wrong with my voice.
Well, it's just sort of.
Hello, Dad.
Susan? Guys, I think it's about time to get in the car and maybe see some green things.
What are these green things you speak of?
This weekend, unplug. Getting closer to nature can get you closer to your family. To find the forest nearest you, go to discovertheforest.org. Brought to you by the U.S. Forest Service and the Ad Council.
Let's segue over to the legal. There again, we can't list all those terms, and the plus at the end of LGBTQIA plus isn't specific enough for legal documents. So how do we do that?
It's really challenging. And so I don't know, Robin, if you have thoughts on this, and you mentioned how SOGIE sounds like predominating a lot of the research right now. But I will say in Connecticut, there have been a number of legislative initiatives that try to focus on more specificity of language in support of the queer community. For example, earlier this session, a lot of us came out for Senate Joint Resolution 35, which was a proposed amendment to the Connecticut Constitution that aims to explicitly prohibit discrimination because of sexual orientation, gender identity, or reproductive decisions. And so all of that language in the joint resolution was really laid out very explicitly. And that was amazing. I mean, I think they had, last I checked, was like 2,500 testimonies came out from across the state in support of it. Robin and I were both there. And then actually recently, the network has done some work around House Bill 6913, which addresses discrimination in long-term care facilities. And again, the addition of language that is more specific to the queer community, this prohibits the denial of admission based on sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or HIV status, prohibits misgendering or inappropriate room assignments that don't align with residents' gender identity. And all of those additions were in response to negative lived experiences that we had heard from aging queer folks in the community who were having these hard times in these long-term care facilities. Your question is, how do we enact legislation that does a better job of encompassing all the minoritized identities under SOGIE? Robin, you mentioned that's a lot of the research you're seeing. Have you seen anything cutting edge right now?
You could say something like no discrimination on the basis of SOGIE, actual or, and it's important to use both actual or perceived. Everybody has a SOGIE, so it means that nobody can be discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And, in the states where you can still be fired for being trans, they're not even using most of the time gender identity as the reason to be able to fire people. They're using gender expression because sex is covered under the law. So the federal law. And so technically you can't really fire trans people because they're just, especially binary trans people because they're a man or a woman, but you can fire people based on how they express their gender because that is not covered. It's not explicitly included in the legislation. And if it's not explicitly included, it is explicitly excluded. So they can say, I don't like how you do your masculinity. And you can be fired for that. And they're not violating federal statutes. So unless they have state statutes, like in Connecticut, we have state statutes that include gender expression. But I think it's still 24, 25 states that don't have that's how they sort of get in there with violating the spirit as well as the text of the law.
It seems to me that opens all sorts of opportunities to play legal whack-a-mole. If you can do that, if you can say that my expression of my femininity is not acceptable in your workplace, isn't that the same as saying all cisgender women must wear a dress or a skirt? Right? Things that, as a society, we've long since moved past.
Right.
But that could easily be then legislated back in.
Exactly. And certainly they're legislating a lot of things that we thought were settled. It's really, it definitely is really scary. People have been fired because they're fat. People have been fired for lots of different reasons. And you have no recourse because if it's not explicitly included, it is explicitly excluded, and you can't file for discrimination.
I'm thinking particularly of on-camera folks and the airline industry where age.
Yeah, I don't think it is anymore, but it used to be for sure. That they only hired women, and they only hired a certain kind of woman.
Not this kind of woman.
Yeah.
Let's just draw the
not
attention.
This kind of woman
it's
either.
Not
this kind of woman either.
There's the specificity problem of it's impossible to specify everything. So again, this SOGIE container is at least a good place to start.
I got a little pushback at the conference. I said that everyone has a pronoun, and someone said in the feedback said, well, that was very well intended. Not everybody has a pronoun. Some people don't use pronouns at all.
Yes, you do.
Your senses must be short.
I was going to say, yes, you do. You might not use it in terms of your gender expression, your gender identity, but yeah, life without pronouns is awful.
There's a lot of articles and prepositions. I do think that raises an interesting issue that I think about a lot around education. And around the idea of being really well-meaning and really well-intentioned, but just simply not knowing what I'm talking about. So my master's degree was in comparative literature, kind of circling back to what we talked about at the beginning around the word queer. The concept of academia being really alienating and exclusionary, I think is really hard for folks of all identities, no one ever wants to feel like they're being talked down to. No one ever wants to feel like they're being condescended to. So whoever gave you that feedback, Robin, of well, I don't use pronouns, who knows? They might be a TERF out here who's very anti-pronoun, or they might just simply not know that's not a thing I do. I try in my work, and I work in the ivory tower of higher education, but I try to keep that in mind. I think it's easier for me as a white man too to lean into my privilege where I can assume the best of folks as much as possible. But I think trying to keep that in mind, people just might not know what it is we're talking about.
And I also make the point that, that we have neural pathways on he and she and they in certain ways, right? If you think about it, we've done it thousands and thousands of times since we first learned about pronouns in, second grade or whatever. And so it does take a little time for people to develop some new neural pathways.
I feel that pronouns was the wrong hill to fight on. It's one of the first things that opposition grabbed onto, that we were forcing people to use pronouns they weren't comfortable with. I'm saying this as someone who gets misgendered all day, every day. I know how frustrating it is. And I know that after the 47th one, it can put me into a spiral. But ultimately, if the response isn't something that encourages conversation, if my response is to get ticked off or to get sulky within myself, which is my go-to mood, if it's not something that invites people in to an understanding of that, then we're going to lose that argument. And that's, I feel that the initial fight over respect my pronouns was a strategic error. So let's follow that road a little bit. How do we make our points in a way that invites people into the discussion rather than scolds them?
Carly uses the term space and grace, and I've sort of adopted that from her, that humans are human. We're going to make mistakes. And so one of the ways I approach the conversation is that, first of all, you got all these neural pathways. So you got to create some new ones. Got to give yourself some space and grace to learn new things, and to practice new things. At the end of the day, you got to sort of start holding yourself accountable. So the analogy that I use is to ask how many people have had their names mispronounced, and then how many people have had their names mispronounced multiple times by the same person. And so what's the message? So they generate the response, which is, well, they don't care enough, that kind of stuff. And I said, well, it's sort of the same things with pronouns. Got to have space and grace because we're all human and we're going to continue to make mistakes. So make a quick apology and move on. But eventually you got to get it right. And if you can't get it right, just use their name. Back when I was doing organizing for the conference, I always worked with a group of young people as, organizers. And so we always started with pronouns. And one young person, as we went around, said the pronouns were it and that. And so as a social worker, I went, okay.
Oh no.
So I had this whole internal response. And so I put on my best social worker voice and I said, I wonder, might I ask you how you arrived at those pronouns? And it said, no, you may not, because the question is a judgment. And I was like, you are absolutely right. And so I still had trouble with it. So for the first 2 weeks, I just used its name. And then I just got the hell over myself. And realized that if I was going to build a relationship with this kid, I had to call it what it wanted to be called. And who knows, 5 years from now, they're going to use whatever they're going to use. But to build a relationship, I had to get over myself and just go with their flow.
But I would point out that, you were able to put on your social worker hat and have a professional moment of awareness of that situation. Yeah. If somebody reacts to me that angrily, that indignantly, no, you may not, more than likely I'm going to get defensive myself. Yeah. Say, okay, then this conversation is over. I'm sorry, I tried.
Yeah. And I don't, and I try really hard to not respond defensively to feedback. I try really hard to just, take it in, listen, use the parts of it that feel helpful and let the rest of it go. But I think that's something that I've worked on for years and years and years to be able to do that. And most people from their education or they just haven't had the experience of learning that particular skill. And so people do get very defensive. And once someone gets defensive, they check out and you can't have a conversation anymore.
Yeah, you're done for that that interaction. Bill, when people come into the Justice and Opportunity Network, what are the attitudes? Are they coming in frustrated? Are they coming in angry? Are they coming in sad?
That's such a good question. So we meet virtually once a month and as a full network. And then outside of that, there's a lot of work done just in pairs or small groups, kind of depending on what the current situation is and current events. I do think everyone is exhausted. That is sort of the general energy that we bring, just following the news and being in these spaces these days ever since basically January and arguably before also, but it's certainly heightened in 2025. I do think folks, while tired, bring a spirit of problem solving as much as possible. And we are really able to put our heads together a lot. So there's a lot of us. The network is sprawling and we don't limit our meetings at all. So if anyone wants to join, reach out to me. I can send you the Zoom info. And so sometimes there's a lot of us and it can take a while to get onto the same page. And we have a lot of spirited debate over some more nuanced situations. But I do think everyone, you can at least be faithful you can have faith in the fact that everyone is working towards the same goal, trying to undo the oppression that we're all facing on a day-to-day basis.
I agree. It's usually, there's lots of really good conversations, I think, and I think there's always the need to do more. But, I think that we did a lot this year that we gave out, I think, $206,000 in grants. And we were able to really move those grants around to people that could leverage them. And also to move the grants to people who might be, not getting money in other places, And so that I think was a really good thing. I think we did a lot of work with the legislature this year. To help them understand what the committee does and what value it brings. And so I think that was a really powerful piece.
A lot of our members, everyone is doing so much unique and interesting work all across the state. And a lot of it's incredibly inspiring. Claire, do you know Regina Dighton? Have you worked with her before? She's awesome. Every time she opens her mouth, I'm just like in awe of whatever she has to share. But so it's called Divinely You, right, Robin? The org that she works
Divinely
with.
You is Nadine Ruff is the person who runs it in New Haven. But Regina is working with Nadine, helping them build themselves into a 501c3.
And I've just heard Regina talk a lot about the responsibilities of leadership in the queer community. And especially in this conversation, we're focused so much on language, but if you're putting something out and if you are trying to tout yourself as a leader in the community and you want to be a resource to folks across the state, really keeping in mind how your language is accessible or not accessible to folks who are just simply have so little access to any sort of privilege. Regina talks a lot about Black trans sex workers living above the poverty line or right below it. How are they going to interpret the information on the network's website? Like, if they have not had the privilege of finishing even high school, like, are the resources that we're putting out there going to be accessible and therefore helpful to them? And I just find Regina really awesome and inspiring. So,
yeah. Anything else?
I was going to say,
thank you for the opportunity, Claire.
No, thank you so much for doing this. All right, my friends, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll see you soon.
Take care.
Claire.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Robin.
Bye.
See you both soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You are listening to WESU Middletown 88.1 FM. Let's end this program with a look at personal pronouns, what they do and how they do it. There are other types of pronoun, relative, demonstrative, etc., but they're not relevant to our gender identity and expression conversation. Let's start, as so many wonderful things do, with Bernadette Peters.
Lesson number 8. Pronouns. What is a pronoun? A pronoun is the word used in the place of a noun. Do you recall what a noun is? Certainly I recall.
So that's what a pronoun is. That's what a pronoun does. Now let's put this to use in a quick story.
Claire has 4 cats. Claire feeds Claire's cats dry food in the morning. Claire feeds Claire's cats wet food in the evening. Claire's cats would prefer that Claire feed Claire's cats wet food all day, but Claire can't afford that.
If you speak or write or text this way, please get some professional help. The job of a pronoun is to replace a noun and therefore avoid the repetition and the silliness that happens in that story.
Claire has 4 cats. She feeds them dry food in the morning. She feeds them wet food in the evening. They would prefer that she feed them wet food all day, but she can't afford that.
So lesson number 1 is pronouns exist and we have to use them. I just did in that sentence. And again in that one. Oh, I'm sorry. Theodore, you had something you wanted to say?
Well, I'm Ted Cruz, and my pronoun is kiss my ass.
Yes. Well, let's see if that works. Here's a passage.
Ted Cruz is a U.S. Senator from Texas. Ted Cruz was born in Canada. Senator John McCain called Ted Cruz a wacko bird. Former Speaker of the House John Boehner called Ted Cruz Lucifer in the flesh. Senator Lindsey Graham said, "If you killed Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate, and the trial was in the Senate, nobody would convict you."
Now, the same passage, but let's substitute your suggestion for a pronoun.
Kiss my ass is a U.S. Senator from Texas. Kiss my ass was born in Canada. Senator John McCain called kiss my ass a wacko bird. Former Speaker of the House John Boehner called kiss my ass Lucifer in the flesh. Senator Lindsey Graham said, "If you killed kiss my ass on the floor of the Senate, and the trial was in the Senate, nobody would convict you."
As you can see, that doesn't work. If it can't act in the place of a noun, then it isn't a pronoun. But thank you for sharing. From here on out, let's just restrict our comments to things that actually make sense. There are 3 flavors of personal pronoun. First person is for describing the speaker. I in the singular, we in the plural. Second person, you in both the singular and the plural, is for the person being spoken to, and third person, wait for it, is describing some third person that isn't you or me. Notice that 5 of the 6 forms are gender neutral. We are we, regardless of the gender makeup of the group. You are you, whoever you are. But third person singular is gendered. He, she, it. And if we return to lesson number 1, we have to use pronouns, then we have to choose which form of the third person singular pronoun to use. This has been a problem in English since the mid-late 1800s, when women started working towards suffrage. And then when women began entering the workforce, it became even more pressing. Why? Because English had gotten really comfortable, linguistically, with the notion that there was a hierarchy of gender, and that men were at the top. All men are created equal. Man cannot live by bread alone. And so the language needed to evolve to keep pace with a changing society. Professor Dennis Barron, in his book, What's Your Pronoun? Beyond He and She, lists some 250 attempts to create a gender-neutral third singular pronoun in English. You have never heard of the vast majority of them because these were suggestions by linguists, journalists, lawyers, satirists, but they never actually caught on in real use. In my opinion, there are only 2 possible contenders for solving this language problem. And, let me just point out, this problem predates our conversation about trans and non-binary by at least a century. The first solution is the word one, as in one does not simply walk into Mordor. It solves the problem, but it's very specifically associated with an upper-class British context, so much so that American English speakers are just never going to adopt it. The other option is singular they. First of all, they solves the language problem. They can replace he or she or it. Second, you use it all day, every day. Hey, look, someone just dropped a $5 bill. I wonder if they realize they dropped it. Do you think they'll get mad if I just pocket it? Hey, a telemarketer just left a message on my voicemail. Really? What were they selling? We all do it, and nobody has a problem until we start talking about trans people. And I know what some of you are murmuring. Hey, they is plural. You can't use it with a singular antecedent. Also, that would mean we'd have the same pronoun for third singular and third plural. Way too confusing. I'll address your second point first. We already do this with the second person pronoun. You in the singular, you in the plural. When I say you are allergic to dairy, I could be speaking to one person or to a room full of the lactose intolerant, and we figure it out from context very easily. As to your first objection, all the following authors use singular they. For the benefit of those of you who are not watching the video version of this, let me read the slide. Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Matthew Arnold, John Galsworthy, Langston Hughes, Elizabeth Bennet, John Ruskin, Geoffrey Chaucer, the Oxford English Dictionary, George Eliot, Lord Byron, C.S. Lewis, John Milton, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Henry Fielding, William M. Thackeray, Herbert Spencer, and Ursula K. Le Guin. If you honestly believe that you know more about the English language than these people, then the problem isn't pronouns. And it isn't gender-expansive people. The problem is you. Get over yourself. I'll end where we started. Ooh, 2 pronouns in that one. Our culture is having a conversation about gender, and that dialogue requires a shared vocabulary. I hope this episode has helped in some small way to facilitate respectful and ongoing conversation. And that brings to a close this series of shows celebrating Middletown Pride. My sincere thanks to Bree Scavera and Middletown Pride for this opportunity. Listeners, if you've enjoyed these shows, reach out to Middletown Pride. Show them some love. You can find them at info@middletownpride.org. Thanks as well to WESU for sending Transqat out on their airwaves. WESU Middletown, 88.1 FM, one of the nation's oldest continually broadcasting non-commercial radio stations, serving Middletown and the greater Middletown area since 1939. By the way, the top 4 songs that year were
I heard of once in a lullaby. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root.
If you missed any of the episodes in this series, they're archived at the Middletown Pride website. Click on Conversations on Pride from the main menu. You can also access them at transqat.com/podcast and everywhere podcasts are available. This is also the final episode of Season 3 for Transqat the podcast. It has been a remarkable season. We started with wrestler and MMA fighter Mac Beggs. We talked about the nature of hope with the Reverend Darrell Goodwin. Poet Joy Layden and I discussed our relationships with God, and Congressman Barney Frank laid out the history of LGBTQ+ rights in America. We've supported the community with episodes featuring PFLAG, the Out Accountability Project, Free Mom Hugs, Prism Counseling, and Q+. And episode 78 was a very special Love Out Loud Valentine's Day, a collaboration with friend of the show, Sam Avery. If these 5 shows have been your introduction to Transqat, you can learn more and access the full catalog of 93 episodes at transqat.com. That's TRANSQAT.com. My thanks as well to Small State Provisions, Sam Avery Media, the CTGLC, and Outfilm CT for sponsoring episodes this season. The show will be on hiatus through July and August, but will return in the fall with Season 4. I'm already lining up guests, including something special for our 100th episode. In theory, I'm supposed to be taking the summer to recharge and get caught up on projects around the house, but the reality is I have an October 1st deadline for delivering my revised draft of a novel to my publisher. Lastly, I need to thank the team behind Transqat the podcast. Newt is our CEO, and he wants to remind you that any time can be dinner time if you just put your mind to it. Sun, our CFO, is a shoulder cat, and you can see her in action in a number of the video episodes at our YouTube channel. Transqat's executive producer is the Lady Bethesda. Her resume lists work experience with Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite, and Rachel Maddow, although she refuses to give me Rachel Maddow's cell number. The lead researcher, scheduler, webmaster, and director of social media for Transqat is my beloved Nomi. Nomi has taught me the true meaning of vigorous head-rubbing time, and her snuggles have kept me sane for one more year. I love all 4 of you more than I can say. This has been Transqat. I'm Claire McCarthy. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again in a few months.
This is Sadie McCarthy. I'm Claire's niece.
And you've just been listening to Transqat. It is made by one of my favorite people in the world, Claire McCarthy.
Transqat is a production of Transqat Enterprises, LLC.
Copyright 2023, all rights reserved.
Join us on the web at transqat.com.
That's TRANSQAT.com.
QAT.com.
QAT.com.
There you'll find links to Transqat, the blog,
writing projects,
speaking engagements,
and our PayPal donations page.
Please
consider supporting our mission with your monkeys.
Monies.
Your monies.
Your monies. Not monkeys.
Please consider supporting our mission with your monies. Any monkeys will be gratefully received as well.
Follow Transqat on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
On TikTok, we are at The Real Transqat.
Want to tell your story on air?
Or ask Claire a question?
What is the deal?
She has all the answers.
Or suggest a guest or topic for an upcoming episode.
Use the contact page at the website
or email her directly at crmtranscat@gmail.com.
crmtranscat@gmail.com.
And thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening. Bye.